You're watching JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. So welcome to JCT TV, friends. Jim Cantelon here. Always nice to be with you. For some of you, we've been interacting for over 8 years. Can you believe it? And all we do is go through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John. I include Acts because it's really part 2 of Luke. But we are right in the middle now of the story of what's called the Passion, the arrest, the crucifixion, the resurrection of Jesus. Fascinating reading, and we'll get to it right after this.
Wow! Working for Orphans and Widows has been caring for orphans and widows in Africa and India for over 20 years. Key to its vision is partnership with local champions who engage hundreds of church-based volunteers in home-based care. Care for the sick and the dying in their own humble homes. They are defenseless and afflicted. They are the least of these that Jesus would have us love and care for. Our partner champions are based in South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and India. They provide faithful, accountable, and godly care for thousands. Together with WOW, they truly are the hands and feet of Jesus to the sick and the dying. Founder and president Jim Cantelon has been committed to both teaching the gospel via Jim Cantelon Today TV and practicing the gospel through WOW. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
So friends, Easter is still a few months away, of course, and it would be perfect if, I was able to cover this aspect of the life of Jesus at that time. But we're just following the Bible as we follow it. We've been in Matthew a long time, and now we're at the story of all of the events surrounding the arrest, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. And it is gripping reading, and I'm not going to rush it. I'm going to take my time, and what will be in terms of how many weeks it takes us to get through this, what's called the Passion of Jesus. Okay, let's pick it up in verse 17 of Matthew 26. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He replied, "Go into the city to a certain man, tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house." So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, prepared the Passover. And when evening came, Jesus was reclining at table with the 12. While they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were very sad, and began to say to him one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." Jesus replied, "The one who's dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go, just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." Jesus answered, "You've said so." While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day, when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Now, this is the famous Last Supper scene, and Matthew's not the only one who covers this, and we'll be going through it again very soon as we go through some of the other Gospels. But when you think about the Last Supper, probably you, in your mind, have a picture of one of the most recognizable murals of all the art world, called The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. It's something that goes right back to the latter part of the 15th century. It's a powerful, evocative interpretation of the Passover Seder that Jesus celebrated with his disciples. It represents history, solemn regard for the Passion. In fact, any attempt I make to casually comment, and hopefully what I'm doing here is casual commentary, but my approach seems, I think, superficial in light of the worshipful efforts of artists and authors and theologians who have made such effort to depict it throughout the centuries. Because it was, and it is, truly one of the world's most memorable moments, this Last Supper. And something I should say here as a kind of a caveat, I'm not going to yield to exactitude in terms of Matthew's chronology. I'm just going to relate the general sweep of the story, leaving the parsing of times and dates to others whose interests and abilities are way beyond mine. Okay? So, verse 17 says, on the first day of unleavened bread. In Israel, we would refer to this as Hag Pesach, Passover. But you have the Passover day, and then you have the days of unleavened bread that begins with the Passover, 7 days altogether. So this first day, the actual Passover day, is in many ways referred to as a day of preparation. To this day in Israel, like for Sabbath, for instance, and I remember this so well from the 7 years that my wife and I and our 3 kids lived in Jerusalem. Shabbat, or Sabbath, or any other holy day for that matter, consists of the day or days before the actual event. The preparation day does, and that leads into the actual event itself. So when we lived in Jerusalem, Shabbat was there every week, of course, and Friday was my favorite day. Why? Because in Israel, the day begins at sundown, not at daybreak. So Shabbat, Sabbath, which is Saturday, begins at sundown on what we call Friday. So it's like Friday night, sundown. Okay, it's hard to get your mind around this. It took us a while when we moved to Israel back in 1981 just to kind of grasp, what was going on. It took us a few weeks to, recognize that stores and restaurants and pretty much everything else was closed on Saturdays. It took us a long time really to make that adjustment. Eventually we did. You live there 7 years, you make the adjustment. But I loved Fridays, Yom Shishi in the Hebrew, which means day the 6th. My office was just a block or two away from the Prime Minister's home in Jerusalem. So it was very much a downtown setting. And I would notice around maybe 2:30 in the afternoon, the traffic that was always streaming past my office window would drastically reduce to the point where there was hardly anybody driving by. The buses, of course, had stopped, and hardly anybody in a private car was driving by. And I'd look out the window, and I would see family units dressed in their Shabbat best, usually carrying a bottle of wine and some challah bread and flowers. You always have to have flowers, going to their mom and dad's place, for Kabbalat Shabbat, which in Hebrew, the welcoming the Sabbath. And before the sun sets, the women of the household, they do a special little ceremony with candles. It's very moving. And then right at the moment of sunset, you hear this massive siren all over the city. And Jerusalem's not a small city in terms of territory for sure. But everybody in Jerusalem and the surrounding area hears this siren. And what the siren is telling you is that Sabbath has begun. And at that point, work ceases. There's hardly any traffic anymore, apart from maybe some secular Israelis who don't necessarily have regard for Sabbath observance. It's a beautiful time. I used to love walking to my office. That was an hour away walk, but it was a good walk. And in Jerusalem, you're walking up and down, so good exercise too. And I would walk home, as Sabbath was descending. And it was just, the city was full of setting sunlight. The walls of the old city at that time of day looked golden in color. It's interesting, by the way, seeing those walls of the old city. Sometimes they're bright white, sometimes they're lavender, sometimes they're pink, sometimes they're orange, sometimes they're gold, and sometimes they're gray. It all depends on the time of day and the angle of light and whether or not there are clouds. It's a beautiful time to walk. I used to love it. And I would come home, and we often would have our own Kabbalat Shabbat, even though we're not Jewish. My wife would have it all prepared, and we'd sit with our kids, and I would read from the scriptures, and we would thank the Lord for his faithfulness. Now, in this case, in fact, in every case, Passover starts on Nisan the 14th, which is our equivalent to, I think, about April the 7th, sometimes the 7th, the 8th, sometimes 6th. There are some variances, because we're the Julian calendar, not the Hebrew calendar. But preparation began on that Friday. And sometimes to prepare for the preparation, there'd be a flurry of activity the day before, just like there is with us, with holidays and so on. You got a Thanksgiving coming, you got Christmas coming. People are out shopping, 2 and 3 days before the actual event. So anyway, Jesus is close to Jerusalem. He sends his disciples to some anonymous person, a certain man, which simply tells me that Jesus had a lot more contacts than we're given access to in the scriptures. And why not? The scriptures are a summary. They're not a detailed day-by-day report. But anyway, this was a man who was known to Jesus, and all he had to say was the master, and the man would know who was speaking. And we read, have him help you out with his preparation. So, at the meal, Jesus seemed quite relaxed, above the fray, and without any expression of emotion. At least Matthew doesn't, tell us there was any emotion. He simply says, one of you guys, you're going to betray me. I mean, this must have fallen on them like a lead balloon. I mean, what a shock to hear this. I mean, they've just spent 3 years with Jesus every day, through the Galilee especially, and then through the cities and towns of Israel, and now in Jerusalem. And we've been loyal friends. We've given up our day jobs to travel with you. And now you're telling us one of us is going to betray you? They looked at one another in astonishment. I would too, wouldn't you? We'll get back to the story right after this.
Wow! Working for Orphans and Widows is a trusted Christian charity reaching out to the sick and the dying, the least of these in pandemic-stricken Africa and India. For over 22 years, Jim and Kathy Cantelon have engaged with community-based champions and church volunteers in the care for those whom Jim calls society's weakest link. Everything from home-based palliative care to the rescue and protection of young women and girls who are victims of abuse is done in the name of Jesus and is overseen by local partner champions and an army of church-based volunteers. WOW has a proven track record. Check it out on wowmission.com, or if you wish, you can call or write to us. Its sustainability is dependent on the support of faithful friends like you.
So it was a shocking moment one of you is going to betray me. What? Looking at one another? Is it me, Lord? And Jesus says, it's the guy who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me. Now, in a Passover Seder, you have a number of small bowls of food. And most of them have special significance. You got bitter food, you got sweet food, you got... Anyway, you should Google Seder, Passover Seder, and then drill down into the actual ingredients of the meal. And so you have a number of bowls, and you generally eat it with unleavened bread, pita, not pita, but, I forget what you call it now. It'll come to me. But unleavened bread, and sometimes you dip that, in the bowl, but you're eating with your hands. You're not using knives and forks. So he says, whoever has dipped his hand in the bowl with me is the one who's going to betray me. Well, the fact is that could mean any of them, because they were all dipping their hands into the bowl. But he does say that it would have been better for this man to never have been born. So he foresaw what was going to happen with Judas. And then he takes two of the most common elements of Jewish life, bread and wine. And I do mean common elements. Bread and wine are everywhere in Jewish culture. Not bread and drunkenness, by the way. It's interesting. 7 years living in Israel, I never saw anyone inebriated. It's not done. You don't drink to get drunk. And they're always astonished, especially when they come to, say, North America, for instance, to see our emphasis on drinking and all of the ads for alcohol beverages. And in fact, one of my congregants, he worked for the Israeli government, and he was in Canada for the first time on some business, and he came back and he said, "Jim, what is it with you Canadians and your beer?" I said, what do you mean? Everywhere on television, there are these ads for beer, and everybody's having a happy time. Everybody looks young. For us Israelis, for you it seems to be a lifestyle. For us Israelis, it's a drink, better than Coca-Cola. Cultural differences, cultural dissonance. Anyway, he takes these two common elements, bread and wine, and forever identifies them as trigger mechanisms. That's what I call them, trigger mechanisms for remembering the new covenant, for forgiveness of sins and the impact that his spilt blood on Calvary would have. Bread and wine are just so common, as I say, in Israel, but especially with Passover Seders and with Kabbalat Shabbat, welcoming the Sabbath every Friday night. I've been to not only a number of Seders over the years in Israel, in Jerusalem, but also a number of Kabbalat Shabbat meals with Israeli friends of ours over the years. And the ritual is this: the oldest male, usually it's the grandfather, at this family dinner, will stand at the end of the table, and he'll hold up the wine, and he will say, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth fruit from the vine." And then he puts it into a cup, and everybody just has a little sip, including the children. And then he'll take the bread, and he'll break it, and he will say, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." And then passes that around. And you couldn't ask for more common elements than bread and wine in Israeli culture. Well, it's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. The big issue for the Lord when you study the Old Testament is how the children of Israel continually, constantly, faithfully forgot about him, forgot that he was the one who delivered them from Egypt, who cared for them for 40 years wandering in the wilderness, who oversaw their entry into the promised land. They forget. And so they got into idol worship and all kinds of other abominable behavior. And time again, God the Father is lamenting their forgetfulness. and reminding them that he's the one who brought them out of Egypt. He's the one who supplied their needs in the wilderness. He's the one who has given them victory as they have taken over the promised land. God does not want to be forgotten. And, God is God. He's not a human. Jesus was fully human, fully God at the same time. But God the Father, I don't really know why he has a need to be remembered, but he does. And I think Jesus also was aware of humankind's forgetfulness. He wanted to be remembered. So what does he do? He takes two of the most common elements, something that is a part of every Friday night Kabbalat Shabbat, something that's a part of every yearly Passover Seder, and says, when you drink the wine and you have the bread, think of me. The blood should remind you, the wine should remind you of my shed blood, the bread of my broken body. Now, this has been a huge issue, of course, throughout church history. And for centuries and centuries, there was debate, about what we call the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. Do you know that until 16th century, the priests would take the wine and the bread, but the layman was only allowed the bread. They could not drink the wine. That was one issue that was addressed by Luther and others in the Protestant Reformation. Then there's been the big argument over, well, does the bread and the wine actually become the blood and body of Jesus? This is called transubstantiation. And of course, this was the view for centuries and centuries. And then it began to change again during the time of the Reformation. And there was all kinds of theological debate and even some battles fought over this issue. I'm sorry that this has happened in history, because certainly from my perspective, I see trigger mechanism. I see a powerful remembrance vehicle in bread and wine, constantly being served every Friday night in Jewish homes and every Passover. When you eat the bread, when you drink the wine, remember me. I can't take it any farther than that. Jesus knew he was heading for a cross. He also knew he would rise again. But he knew there would be drama. He knew there would be gaps in the chronologies and the expected sequence of events. And, we human beings, we like order. We like things to, happen according to the chronological time frame. He knew that we wouldn't be totally happy with how heaven's economy works itself out. Nevertheless, even in the gaps, remember me, okay? So after this, he leads them in a hymn. Now this hymn is probably what's called the Hallel of Psalm 113 to Psalm 118. You should read it. Here you have hymnology, really. Hymns of Israel sung, especially during Passover. But there's also the Great Hallel, as it's called. Hallel is H-A-L-L-E-L, H-A-L-L-E-L. The Great Hallel, which is Psalm 136. I got a couple of minutes before the break. Let me just read a little bit of Psalm 136. You're familiar with it, I'm sure. This they sang. Give thanks to the Lord for he is good, and then his love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, his love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, his love endures forever. To him who alone does great wonders, his love endures forever. So there is this rhythmic kind of counterpoint with Psalm 136, and it's all done to some known melody. I don't know which melody it was when Jesus and the disciples sang it, but when you see Psalm 136, when you read it, you got to remember it was definitely one of the psalms that was sung. Now there's all kinds of other psalms that were sung as well, but this one was the great one, the great Hallel. This was the big one, the best one, the most enduring one, the one that was most commonly sung by Israel, especially during Passover. So there you go. This would have been a very solemn moment. I think the disciples were still very troubled. One of you is going to betray me. I mean, you don't get over the shock of that real quick. And then there's talk of Jesus' death and resurrection. In some of the other accounts, not so much here in Matthew. But this was why in John, for instance, he says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. And in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And I'm going to come back and take you unto myself. This was a critical moment in the history of salvation. I'll be back right after this. So friends, I don't mean to be too casual when it comes to what I'm teaching here with regard to the Lord's Supper. But the fact of the matter is, it's rooted in history. This event actually took place somewhere in Jerusalem. There is a sense that the upper room was probably the second story of John Mark's mother's home. And I know where that was located. I've been there many times when I lived in Jerusalem. But it happened in history. These are the actual words of Jesus. And he's saying, don't forget me. Don't forget me. And that's a good word, especially in the secular age in which we live. So easy in the flurry and activity, the social media frenzy of life, to forget him. The Lord's Supper has great value. Make sure you attend and participate every time it's served in your church. Thanks for watching. See you again next time.